Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Andrew Cookson. I'm the Managing Director of the JIRA Group. We are consultants and market researchers in the food chain with particular expertise in cooperatives. I've been invited along to talk to you by the Federation of Milk Producers campaign at a very opportune moment in the life of British dairying. For the first time, the farming community, the dairy farming community, can hope to be treated as equals, not just by the processors but also by the retailers. After 5 years of some of the lowest milk prices in Europe, the UK farmers are at last realizing what European farmers realized many years ago, that it is only by grouping together into cooperatives that they can obtain the place that they deserve in the dairy chain, in the dairy supply chain, and that they can not only obtain better prices for their milk, but that they can ensure outlets for their milk for the years to come. The aim of this presentation is to underline to you not just that what you're doing at the moment is right, but that it's been done before, it's been done on a very, very large scale, and that the majority of today's European dairy industry is based on cooperation. What we're going to talk about today is divided into three elements. First of all, I'm going to talk to you about what a cooperative producer group is, and I'm going to give you examples. Then we're going to see that they really do work and have worked and are still working, and I'm going to give you examples from abroad, and we're going to see the extraordinary power and importance of farmer cooperatives in dairy. And finally, we're going to come back to the UK and see exactly the extent to which cooperatives will work in the UK. First of all, however, let's just see what the problem has been until now. Since the abolition of the Milk Marketing Board and of Milkmark, farmers, far too many farmers, have thought they could, or maybe that they had to go it alone. In reality, this is impossible. Let's just look at a few figures, shall we? If you think of the dairies whom you are selling to, in the UK today, there are two of these which together represent 50% of the UK's milk pool of about 13 billion litres. Each one of them, we can say, is probably about 3.5 billion litres. Let's call that 100%. That is the biggest actor in the chain. Let's look now at the retailers, the processors' clients themselves. We've got Tesco's. Now, we don't know how much milk Tesco sells, or at least they're not telling me, but I've just estimated on the basis of their global UK market share, they're probably selling about 2 billion litres. Sainsbury's, maybe 1.5 billion litres of milk. 60% and 40% of what the largest dairies are selling. These are powerful retailers who can talk to powerful dairies. Let's now just look at the individual milk plants. There are 600, 650, 680 milk plants in the UK today. It's simple mathematics to see that they represent about 21 million litres each. That is 0.6% of the largest dairy's milk pool. If you buy yourself a milk plant, if you have a small grouping and you decide, let's buy a milk plant, you can't hope through that one plant to influence the price of milk in the UK. And now let's really look at the smallest element in the chain, the farmer. 20,000, 29,000, I don't know how many there are, they're decreasing regularly. But you are the most efficient and individually the largest dairy farmers in Europe, with about 500,000 litres of milk each. Compare that with the French farmer, who on average produces 200,000, and the German about maybe 150. It looks good, but if you look at the figures, you represent 0.014% of Dairy Crest or Express Dairy's input. Let's look at this now visually. The dairies, 50%, a big, 25% each, a big circle. Tesco's and Sainsbury's, they're big circles as well. But when we come down to our individual dairy, not so big. And can we even see the individual farmer on this scale? No, we can't, because he's too small. No one of you, even if you're producing 1 million or 2 million litres of milk per year, you cannot hope to fight against buyers further down the chain of that sort of size. You've got to be realistic. So where are you in the chain? Let's just see what this dairy supply chain is, and this slide just puts it visually. On the right, you've got, as you can see, a very knobbly, not very happy farmer on his tractor. What comes after the farm? Collecting and packaging. After that, primary processing. Let's call it liquid milk, let's call it cheese. After that, we can have further processing, which can be more developed things, yogurts possibly, dairy desserts, ready meals. After that, it's got to be transported. We've got the logistics companies, then the retailers, and then, of course, the consumer at the end. What do we find when we look in Europe? Where are cooperatives active? Where are they defending the farmers' interests? Well, they're defending the farmers' interests in any way that prepares his product for sale. So if you're talking about meat, you'll find that the farmer cooperatives are slaughtering and cutting the meat because you can't sell live animals anymore. There's good reason to believe that you can't just sell raw milk off the farm either. The continental co-ops are very strong in collecting and packaging, as we'll see. They're strong also in primary processing, and increasingly they're trying to get into, in some cases, further processing. Why? Because if we look further down the chain, we find that there is a continual program of horizontal integration, both among the processors and the retailers. Just think of your own Dairy Crest, or sorry, what was your Dairy Crest. Dairy Crest has just swallowed up the commodity dairy activities of Unigate. It has horizontally integrated. It has become 25% or more of the UK processing industry. Look at the retailers, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes. The retailers are busily gobbling one another up all across Europe. They're getting bigger and bigger because the bigger they are, the cheaper they can buy. And here we are in the UK with just our little farmer at the extreme right. It is not surprising that the milk price you have been getting has been the worst in Europe. So, what's a cooperative? And we're going to come back to this again and again. Best way of looking at this is to look back into history. Now, if we look at the continental cooperative, what we find is that it has always adapted itself to the needs of its farmer members. And it's perfectly logical, because all it is an extension of your farm. Now, the first agricultural cooperatives were created in 1864 by a remarkable man called Raiffeisen in Germany. Now, Mr. Raiffeisen was born in 1818, which was the same year, apparently, as Karl Marx. And one thing we can be sure of, and that is that in 100 years' time, people will still remember Raiffeisen, and Marx will have been long forgotten. What did he do? He was a regional administrator in Germany at a time of acute famine. And what was happening was that the poor peasants had no money to finance the crops, and the people who were lending money to them were profiting from this by charging rates of interest which they simply couldn't afford, and people were starving. So what he did was, he came in, he grouped together not just the farmers, but all of the rural community that saw the problem, and he created a cooperative bank. This cooperative bank received cash from those who had money, and it lent it to farmers to finance their crops. It then took the crops and sold them on behalf of the farmers, and used the proceeds to pay back the loans. And the next year the process happened again. So what was happening was that the rural community was helping itself by funding its farmers to produce, and not just to produce, but also to market their products. It was fighting against excessive demands of lenders. It was only a few years later that this same Raiffeisen thought, well, these farmers who are producing milk, why shouldn't we let them also share some of the benefits of the processing? And the first dairy cooperative was created in 1870, also in Germany. What was this doing? This was reinforcing the position of the producer in the market and capturing added value for the farmer, making him richer, getting him more money per litre. This is not a million miles away from what we're talking about today. Let's jump 100 years. After the war, what happened? We had the Green Revolution in Europe. And what happened there was that governments funded agriculture to produce more of better quality and at lower price throughout the whole of Europe. We call it the Green Revolution. Who played a major role in this? In France, in Germany, in Holland, it was the cooperatives. They were the ideal channel for the government to reach farmers, to subsidize purchases of equipment, and to push technology down to farmers. The cooperative had changed its role, it had adapted to the modern times. It managed to increase quantities and quality while lowering costs. Fine. So what's the role of the co-op today? The co-op also has a role today, obviously, because once again there is a need for farmers. Now, let's see what that need is, and let's put it into its context. Let me come back to my retailers. Remember that the retailers are almost at the end of the chain. They are the ones who see the consumers. And what's happening is we have been through a considerable period of concentration, horizontal integration, as I called it. And you can see in the UK, in France, in Italy, in Germany today, probably 4 or 5 retailers represent 50, 60, 70% of all purchases of food and obviously of dairy products. The problem for the retailer is, and we mustn't forget that retailers have their problems just like the processors do, is that with the new Europe, which is a reality, and certainly a reality with the euro, none of these retailers represents individually more than 5 or 6% of the European market. What they all want to do, because they know it's a question of survival, is they want to be one of the 5, 6, 7 major retailers who will occupy again 60, 50, 70, who knows what percent of the European food market in 10 years from now. How are they doing that? They're doing it by buying cheaper and cheaper and trying in any way to make consumers loyal to them and not to their opponents. But if we look at this tendency, what we find is that, right, it's accelerating. In 1991, 16%, the top 5 retailers represented 16% of total retailing. In 1998, that was already over a quarter, over 25%. But what is most important is that there are no British retailers in those top 5. It is very, very unlikely that in 10 years' time there will be a British retailer not only in the top 5, but it is highly probable that there won't be one single British retailer which is still British owned. What does this mean? This means not only are we going to have to deal with a Sainsbury's and a Tesco's, which is pretty well all-powerful in the UK, but those buying decisions will not even be made in the UK. They will be made on a central basis from Brussels, from Paris, from Dusseldorf, who knows where they'll come from. And we the farmers, are still at the end of that chain. This is an inexorable process, and we have to come to grips with it. So, I've told you that the cooperative adapts to the needs of its farmers. Where are we today? What are the aims of the cooperative today? What are the aims of your cooperative? Your cooperative has one major aim, and we must never forget it, because it's what makes it so different from all other companies, all other economic structures. That is, it is there to maximize returns on the milk that it sells for you, its members. It is there to keep the farmer's end up in the dairy supply chain. How's it going to do this? Well, first and foremost, it is going to direct your production towards viable markets. We mustn't get carried away with the question of price. There are 2 problems confronting us today in the dairy industry. One is the milk is not paid enough, but secondly, we have to ensure that in 2, 3, 5, 10 years that somebody will be buying our milk. We have to ensure that the outlets to which our milk is going are viable. Also, we're going to have to ensure, through our co-op, enough stability for us as a group of producers to have long-term policies so that we can benefit not only by today's best prices, but over the long term. Thirdly, the cooperative today cannot just be there for the weakest producers, the weakest farmers. It's got to be able to lock in the best producers. And for this, it has to ensure not equality, but equity. Equity means Not that everybody is treated the same, but that everybody is treated fairly. If I'm producing 500,000 litres or 1,000,000 litres, I will expect to get more per litre than somebody who's producing 50 or 100,000 litres. That is a fact of life because I am a cheaper producer. And if my cooperative doesn't recognise that, then I won't stay. This was a major problem with Milkmark, and we must not recreate it. It's not fair. What we're doing through our cooperative, in fact, is we are rebalancing that supply chain which I showed you. We are creating counterbalancing power for farmers so that at last the processors and the retailers will talk to the farmers as equals, which means that at last we can make real progress in the dairy chain and push the dairy industry forward instead of spending all our times fighting. Now, rebalancing the chain means not acquiring absolute power for farmers. We're only a part of that chain, but it involves getting some of the power back that was ours and should have been ours before. So what is power in a supply chain? Power in a supply chain comes from a combination of sources. Firstly, and obviously, it comes from control of scarce resources. You're going to say to me, but milk's not scarce. And then another one of you will say, yes it is, look, the prices are going up. And I say to you that milk at sometimes is going to be scarce and sometimes it's not. In other words, it's going to be a cyclical commodity, like it is everywhere in the world, and that we just have to live with. The aim of the cooperative, of course, is to make sure that when the prices are good, that you, the farmers, benefit from it, that the cooperative can invest, so that in the future, when prices are bad again, you'll suffer less. Power in the supply chain is also, as I've said earlier, a function of your access to viable, to liquid, to good markets. You've got to be able to supply the quantities and the quality that the market requires. And in both the cases of control and access, another element of power is information. And at the moment, the British farmer has virtually no information about his markets. There's no transparency at the processor level and even less transparency at the retailer level. Until we, the farmers, get the power back as an element, the most important, perhaps, element in the dairy supply chain, when we have this power, then we can set up structures to get the information which will allow us to play our role, our proper role in that supply chain. What else do we need? We need to be able to innovate, we need to be able to ensure quality, and we need to be able to assure consumer recognition of our products and what we're doing. And the present state where today, where a farmer, an individual farmer represents, if you remember the figure, 0.014% of, let's say, Dairy Crest's milk pool, that is an impossibility. With the cooperatives and with a federation of cooperatives, not only do we have hope, but we have the certitude that if we all work together, we can make the UK no worse than any of the other major dairy countries in Europe, and we can return the supply chain to balance. Now, what are you most interested in today? You're interested in price. What are cooperatives going to do for the price? Now, it's very important that we should understand what the role of the cooperative is in price formation, dairy price formation in a given country, because very often there are misconceptions. Now, this wonderful table here is about 5 or 6 years old. It really doesn't matter. It is the price table for Holland, for milk in Holland, and it's an average 87 to 91 price. Now, the interesting thing about it is that it starts at the top with a company whose name I can't pronounce, which was paying the most money, let's call that 100%, and it goes down to the lowest payer, who was paying 97% of that. Now, where are the co-ops in there? The co-ops at that date were right at the bottom. They were, compared to the very most expensive payer, they were paying 2.5% less than him. Was this important? Well, it was important from a communication point of view, but in reality, those three cooperatives, which I've just put a ring round there, Quebeco, Campina and Friesland, which are now only two because two of them have merged, represented 80 to 85% of the Dutch milk pool. So if you take it on a weighted average, they were not paying 2.5%, they were paying much less than that, less than the highest payer. But nonetheless, it was perceived by the cooperative members as being a bad thing. In reality, those cooperatives were supporting the milk price. The companies paying more than them were much smaller, and what they did, and what they still do to some extent, is they waited until the cooperative announced its price, and then they offered a few pennies more. Now the point about that I'm getting to here is that those cooperatives were supporting the milk price, and it's quite obvious. What's happened since then is that the cooperatives had a word in the ear of some of these small companies and have explained to them that it really is rather silly trying to pay more when they don't need to, and it would be much better that they should just pay a fair price across the board. And nowadays the cooperatives are certainly further up the scale on this on the payments chart. Now then, let's look at European level at a milk price league table. This table here has got in green the co-ops, and the letter P means private. You can see the countries, and you can see how much they were paying in euros per 100 kilos of milk. Right at the top, you've got a private company called Parmalat. Now, why is it paying more than everybody else? I suggest because it's Italian. Food in Italy has always been more expensive, probably always will be. The consumers seem quite happy to pay it, and Parmalat, why should they pay less to the farmer when they're getting more from the processors and more from the consumer? Let's put it down to being Italian. Who's paying the next best price? The three major Scandinavian cooperatives, Arla Value and MD Foods, were paying very high milk prices, always have done, because they are big cooperatives in very small countries. They have farmers who are heavily invested, and they protect their income very well. They are cooperatives that have been around now for over 100 years. Then if we move down the table a wee bit, we find Danone and Bongras, which are both French quoted companies. They are very much into added value, and they can afford to pay more than some of the German cooperatives who are underneath them, for example. But where are the Brits on this? At the bottom of this table, this was in 1999, these prices, we find Express Dairies paying a little bit more than Milkmark. Milkmark was paying, well, we'll see how much on the next table. But why was Milkmark at the bottom? There's a very interesting reason, which can't just be a coincidence. Of all those cooperatives and private companies, Milkmark was the only one that had no processing, because Milkmark had already been castrated by the government of its processing arm, Dairy Crest, and because of that, its power in the market had been significantly reduced. But even so, let's look at the UK, going back a few years, the last year when Milkmark, towards the end of the life of Milkmark, let's say. Here you've got a table of milk prices, in the centre price per litre, and you'll see that on the right you've got percentages of what Mr. Wiseman was paying in England, of 100%, the second one there. And here again, if we look, where are the cooperatives? The cooperatives, there's the Milk Group, which was quite well placed, and then we've got Scottish Milk and Milkmark right at the bottom. Now here, Milkmark wasn't paying 2.5% less than the highest, it was paying 7% less than the highest. But even here also, you must remember that Milkmark at this time still represented about 60% of the UK milk pool. So if you average it out, weighted average it out, you'll find it was less than 7%. But nonetheless, Milkmark was paying 20.72% pence per litre on average at that time. How many of you today wouldn't say thank you if you'd been receiving 20.72 pence per litre for your milk since 1998? I think most of you would have been quite impressed. So what can we say about Milkmark here? Well, what I'm telling you is that Milkmark also, even at that late stage, was supporting the price, but it was doing it badly. Now you can say that it was doing badly because it was badly managed, because they hadn't changed the personnel from the Milk Marketing Board, everything you like. But let's be honest, it was also doing it badly because it was shackled, it had lost its processing arm, and because it was being shot at by everybody, including the farmers. Government, processors, and the farmers. Everybody was taking pot shots at it. But nonetheless, if you look at it, are you going to tell me it's a coincidence that since Milkmark has effectively been dissolved, the price has gone down to 15, 16 pence per litre, which nobody can explain today why it is so low? I'm telling you that it is so low because there is no longer a cooperative with a large share of the UK milk pool which is supporting the milk price. Okay, let's look now at cooperation in Europe. This table here, once again it's quite old, 1998, gives you the percentage of the national milk pool in the major milk producing countries of Europe which were held by cooperatives. And in here we've put the UK, which was still Milkmark at the time, which at the time was 60% still. And what we note here is that France, which has a very strong cooperative sector, which definitely supports the milk price, which is heavily involved in processing, in fact, the cooperatives collected less milk as a percentage than they were doing in the UK at the time. Look at Germany, which to say also is heavily into processing, cooperative processing. It was collecting only slightly more than the UK. Then we move on to the Netherlands with over 80%, and Denmark and Ireland where there is a cooperative monopoly. Now let me be clear what I mean by that. That means that all the milk is collected by cooperatives. Now this is for historical reasons, and in those countries it is considered to be a good thing and not a bad thing, not just by the farmers but by the ministry and by consumers. Let's now look at the dairy companies in Europe. Now this once again is 1997, and I'll show you the sort of movements we're talking about as well. What you've got here is, at the bottom, you've got what at the time was the largest dairy company in Europe, doing over 4 billion euros turnover, French company called Beignet. But immediately after that company, the next 5 largest dairy companies in Europe are cooperatives. All the cooperatives are in red on this graph. Then the blue ones are quoted companies, only Brits. And then, as I've said to you, the green ones are family companies, including the largest one in Europe at the time. Now, one of the major arguments made against cooperatives is that they're sleepy and not dynamic, and lots of other arguments, mainly pushed out by the private sector and often by the retailers. This is simply not true. If we look at the sort of things that have happened to these major companies since 1997, we can see that there's been a lot of movement, but the majority of that movement and dynamism has been in the cooperative sector. So, for example, if we look at the bottom, we see the Dutch cooperative Campina, which in fact has invaded Germany, where the cooperative sector was very sleepy, and has taken on, has making branded products, has not only pushing Dutch milk into Germany, but is actually structuring the dairy industry directly and indirectly. And the latest step has actually been to bring German farmers in as direct members of the Dutch cooperative itself. Then there's MD Foods, which is the big Danish cooperative, which has merged with the Swede Arla and now has the largest milk pool in Europe with 7 billion litres. If you look at the cooperative, the French cooperative Sodial, which is a heavily branded cooperative, it's been very dynamic in picking up more milk and making itself even more market leader on the UHT liquid milk market in France. If you can then look in Germany, where we've had Nordmilch and MZO, the big cheese producer, they have merged together to create the largest dairy entity in Germany. And okay, we can see that there have been other moves in the private sector as well, not the least of which is the sale of Unigate's dairy activities to Dairy Crest. But the movements in the private sector have been nothing like what we've seen in the co-ops. The co-ops are actively ensuring their positions in the future dairy markets in Europe. Why? To ensure markets for their farmers. Now, the problem we have in the UK is that we're not like the rest of Europe. And one of the ways that we're not like the rest of Europe is in the retail sector. Now, you've all heard of retailers' own brands. The UK has the highest proportion of food sold under retailers' own brands of anywhere in the world. If we look at it globally, it's around 40% of all food sold through retail is sold as a retailer's branded product. Tesco's, Safeways, Sainsbury's. If we look at the other European countries, we find it's much less, 23%, 22%, you can see on this graph here. Now, that means that the retailers themselves are directly controlling the products which they are selling under their own brand. In other words, they're removing power initially from the processors, and people might think from the farmers. And in the dairy sector, this is particularly acute because dairy is an everyday food product. Thank God, that's why so much of it's eaten. And what we find in the UK is that 86% of all drinking milk, one way or another, is unbranded or is under retailer control. Cream is 76%, and even yogurts and dairy desserts, which one could think of as being further processed, more added value, even there, nearly 50% of the market is under direct retailer control. What does this mean for us? It means two things. It means that the farmers really do have to defend their position in the chain, because the retailers are as powerful as they are said to be on the radio and on the TV. But it also means that the retailers are perhaps more intelligent than some of the processors. And it may be that, in fact, there are reasons to believe that if the farmers group themselves together and offer the retailers what they want, which are customer-friendly products with customer-friendly stories to tell about the production of those products, that it can work in our favour, that we will deal more directly with the retailers and perhaps less with some of the processors who've shown themselves so inflexible over recent years. So, if we can obtain a position of respect in the dairy chain, then there is every hope that we can work together with these retailers, initially in the UK, and why not later in Europe. The question is always asked, why should cooperatives be in processing? And there are reports that have come out and the government has said they shouldn't be. And as I've said, Milkmart was castrated of Dairy Crest, and it was a major mistake. So let me just list for you the three major reasons why co-ops have to be eventually in processing, why every other major cooperative in Europe in the dairy chain is also a dairy processor. Firstly, because it is the only way to directly influence the retailers. If you're not dealing with the retailers directly, how do you expect to influence them? How do you expect to explain to them that farming is not just producing nuts and bolts? There's more to it. You're selling more than just 1.5% skimmed milk. You're selling farming to the British population. You've got to be talking to them to influence them. It follows on from that by having contact with the ultimate buyer, the retailer, and thus indirectly the consumer, you will get feedback on market needs. You will be able to adapt your product to market needs. This is already happening in the UK. We see it with small cooperatives, small processors, cheese producers who are reacting to a market need, but they've had to fight to get this information. By having a large cooperative which has processing, this information comes back naturally to the co-op and thus to the farmers. And then, of course, as I've said already, you've got to be in processing to be able to counterbalance the power of the other processors on the farmer. If you have 25% of the market, 30% of the processed market, that is a company which is not going to turn around to you and say, I could pay you more, but I don't want to because I don't need to. And if that company pays more, then other farmers will want their other processors to pay more, and they will. They will be supporting the price from underneath, and that's what we're looking to do. We are going to re-establish balance in the supply chain. Now then, if we look at Europe, we find that not all cooperatives are anything like the size of the cooperatives which you are creating in the UK at the moment. Let me just give you this example here from France. These are three cooperatives, Copagri Bretagne, Cana and Evan, which together before they came together, were doing maybe £200 million worth of turnover in dairy. All products. They were nowhere on any market. They were too small to make an impact. What they did was they created what we call a union of cooperatives. They didn't merge because they have other activities which they didn't want to bring together. What they did was they brought their marketing and processing activities together into a company which they called Leiter, which is based in Brest in Brittany, and they committed themselves to supply these plants. Leiter has now marketed the products and has pushed the brands further, and what we now have is that these three together are the number 2, possibly now the number 1 in branded butter. They're the number 4 in Emmental, the equivalent of our cheddar cheese, and they're very big in milk powders, both for package for human consumption and also for bulk for export. If we look at a map of Brittany, we can see what they've done. At the bottom you've got their brands. Paysan Breton is a major butter brand which they're now extending into other dairy products because consumers throughout France know what it is. And then you've got some minor brands, Even and cheese brands. If we look at the map, we can see what they've been able to do. They have concentrated the production of each of the products, the dairy products which they make, into 1 or 2 plants. They've combined expertise, they've got economies of scale, and it is a business which works. They have created unions which still respect the cooperative ethic and which serve the needs of their farmers. Switzerland today, no, I think this is a couple of years old, had 40,000 milk producers. In little Switzerland, there were probably twice as many dairy producers as in big England. Even worse, these 40,000 were organized into 3,800 local cooperatives. A disaster. These 3,800 co-ops were grouped together into 13 geographical regions. Can you imagine the infighting and the waste and the cost? But what happened was that the Swiss, who are not stupid, realized you can't wipe out 3,800 co-ops from one day to the next. You have to hit the problem from the top. So what they did, and it's a remarkable story, is they brought all of this together into one mega cooperative, the Association of Swiss Milk Producers, SMP. And by bringing it all together, they are starting to rationalize. Now, how did they ensure that this mega cooperative remains controlled by farmers and works in the interest of farmers? They did it in the way that you're going to do it in your cooperatives and that everybody does it in all the cooperatives in Europe in one form or another. There is, in the Association of Swiss Milk Producers, there is an assembly of delegates. These are farmer representatives who are democratically elected by the farmers. There are far too many of them. So they create a board of directors whom they elect. We're still talking about farmers. And then, because there are still too many on this board of directors, which can't meet once a month or once a week, they have a committee of board of directors who handle the day-to-day running of the cooperative from the farmer's point of view. They are the ones who are in day-to-day contact with, underneath, the management of the cooperative, and that management, separated from the farmers, is responsible for marketing the milk, the production, the plant, and as you can see here, handling relations between the French-speaking Swiss and the German-speaking Swiss. But luckily, in the UK, that's not going to be too much of a problem for us. And you probably won't need translation services. Let's take it now more simplistically. How is our cooperative structured? How is it going to be structured if we really want it to work? Because we must understand from the outset that if the form of the cooperative doesn't correspond to the reality, the economic reality, and the way in which we, the farmers, want it to work, then it won't work. And what we're going to find is, at the top here, there's lots and lots of farmers. They may or may not be organised in some countries, as you can see, into smaller cooperatives. In the UK, it is very unlikely that we will have many small cooperatives which themselves will be brought together in unions. It's very expensive, and it's not something which we should try and do. So what we'll see is the farmers being divided into regions, and then their regional representatives will be on the farmers' board. That farmers' board, under its chairman, will control the executive board. The executive board are the salaried employees of the cooperative, and they are the specialists. They do handle the processing, the finance, the marketing, the transport, the shares, the pension plans for themselves and for you. And they are the pros. The important thing is that this works well, but it only works well under one condition. And that is that the farmers who are there to defend their own interests, to give the dynamism to the cooperative, if the owner's not dynamic and doesn't believe, the management certainly won't. The farmers can only fulfill that role if they understand what their management is doing. And this requires a major effort in education. And that is where the UK is a long, long way behind the continent. And this is where the Federation of Milk Groups will have to play its role in helping even the biggest cooperatives set up structures which will educate the farmers' representatives not only in what a cooperative is and how to play their role, but also in what is marketing, what are they actually financing, and how can it be done. We're not going to make accountants of you, we're not going to make human relations managers of you, but you've got to know enough about those aspects of business not to give the answers, but to ask the right questions. But also, at the same time, and we've seen it abroad, if we find that our executives are good marketing men, good finance men, good human relations managers, but they understand nothing about farming, then we're going to be in trouble as well, because they will want to run the company as if it was a company quoted on the stock market, and that is not what we're doing. You must remember that the aim of the cooperative, and I've said it before, is to maximize the price of the milk which is paid to you. It is not to maximize dividends to you. And so this is where we have to make our managers aware of what the reality of cooperation and of farming really is. But even so, the farmers who are going to sit on these boards, who are going to represent their colleagues in the running of the cooperative, they're going to have to be educated, but their life is going to be difficult for the first 5 years. It's going to take time for them to have the courage to ask the questions that need to be asked, to ask the professionals to justify their actions, not to get involved in the day-to-day running, but to be sure that they understand and that they have the ability to control the results and understand what's happening. So what we'll find there is, on the farmers' boards, just as in many, many quoted companies, on the boards will also be other experts. Your bank managers, an accountant, God help us, but we have to have them. And they will not be alone. This is the point. If you are sitting on the board of a cooperative which is treating 3, 4, 5 billion litres of milk, coming from 3, 4, 5,000 farmers, you will have all the help that is needed, or you must ensure that you have all the help that you believe you need. Likewise, we don't want the managers to think like farmers. We want them to think like managers. But as I've said, they've got to be aware that the people they're working for are farmers, what farming is, and how the farmer wants his return on the time and the money which he is investing in his cooperative. These are structures which have been developed over 50 years. They work. There are all sorts of variants which can be perfectly valid. The situation in the UK is not the same as the situation in other countries, or at least not exactly. One would expect to see variations between cooperatives, but the basic structure of the separation of the farmer board and the management is essential, and equally essential is that the farmers should be capable of giving the strategic impetus and judging the results that their management produces. There's no reason why this should not be the case in the UK. Let's sum up now. The key message from what I'm trying to put across to you is that cooperatives do not pull the price of milk up, they push it up. They support the national price. If a significant percentage of the milk pool is in the hands of collectors and marketers whose aim is to pay as much as possible for that milk to the farmers, then the price will be pushed upwards. And we've seen it in every country, and I've shown to you that even in the worst days of Milkmark, it was still functioning. Perhaps not as well as it will do in the future, that's for sure, but it was functioning. Co-ops are necessary. Co-ops ensure outlets for your products, for their members' products. They do this by marketing and by further processing. It is essential that cooperatives in the UK should have a significant position in the dairy processing market. What's a co-op? A co-op is purely an extension of your farm. I hesitate to say it's your tractor, but you have to think of it as something like that. It is there so that your products can be prepared for market and sold in the best way possible. And today, in the dairy industry, that generally means not selling raw milk, but selling processed milk in one form or another. It's an extension of your business, and it is there exclusively to work for you. As I've said, co-ops are the only players in the whole of Western economy whose aim is to pay as much as possible for the raw materials they use. Go along to a quoted company and ask the managing director if it's his aim to pay as much as possible for the raw materials he buys. You'd be locked up, and you'd deserve to be locked up in an asylum. But you should also be locked up if you go along to a cooperative and suggest that its aim is anything other than to ensure outlets which are going to allow it to pay the maximum price to you for your milk. Because if they do that to you, they'll also be doing it for your neighbours and for all the other farmers in the UK. They will be, your cooperative, along with the other cooperatives, will be supporting the milk price in the UK. And finally, and this is not the simplest of all elements, cooperatives work best by working together. The danger is always, you have your little co-op, I have my little co-op, and if we've got nothing better to do, we'll go to the same client and undercut one another. This has been seen, it must not happen, and in the UK, because we're going straight to very large cooperatives, we're not going to fall into these traps. But we must be aware of the fact that even our new big cooperatives must work together. I'm not saying under any circumstances they will collude. I'm not saying that there will be price fixing, there won't be, but they must not fight one another where there is no need to fight one another. This is a fundamental tenet of cooperatives, that they are there to cooperate not just among their members, but with one another. The co-op is there to create a balanced supply chain. It is not there under any circumstances to create a monopoly. And in spite of all the words and accusations that have been thrown against the cooperative sector in the UK, nobody has yet come up with one iota of proof that the milk price has been artificially high thanks to the existence of cooperatives. I think, on the other hand, we can make a pretty good case, and I hope I have done, that the milk price in the UK has been artificially low because of the enforced absence of cooperatives. But it's not over. We're sorting out our affairs in the UK. There's a lot to be done. It's not just the creation of the co-ops. We've got to go much further. We've got to structure them, we've got to make them make sense, and we've got to make them play their real role in pushing forward the value-added part of the dairy chain and the interests of farmers for the future. But what's waiting for us round the corner is really quite worrying, and it makes the question of co-ops not a possibility but an urgency, and that is the abolition of quotas. We have every reason to believe that quotas will be abolished from, let's say, 2008. In reality, as soon as the decision is taken to abolish them, it will be as if they had been abolished. Now, I've spoken to a large number of young farmers on the continent, And every time I've asked them, what will you do when quotas are abolished, the answer is always the same: buy more cows. Because if you're young, if you believe in the dairy industry, you want to push it forward, you want to produce more. That is perfectly normal. But what's going to happen if a lot more milk is produced? There'll be, as it stands in the UK at the moment, it's a problem on the continent, but in the UK it will be a disaster if by then we have not structured farmers into coherent cooperatives. There'll be no control on production, and this will harm the processors, the retailers and the consumers as much as it does the farmers, although the farmers will be in the front line, because prices will go wild. There will be very little control on anything, unless by then you have structured yourself into economic entities which are playing their proper role in the supply chain. What it means for you is that right now you have to start finding and retaining secure and profitable outlets for your milk, so that when there is more milk slushing around the market, your buyers, the retailers, have no reason to abandon you as their suppliers. And the only way of doing this is by creating a solid cooperative base which can, in the UK as in the other countries, will be able to ensure this transition and bring some reason into people, hopefully, before they actually start doing silly things which will harm everybody's interests. So, if we think of the quotas, and if we think of 2008, we can say that we've got 7 years left. 7 years is a very short period of time if you think that it's taken at least 50 for the continental co-ops to build up to the position that they're at the moment. And I'm not saying under any circumstances that all the co-ops in Europe are perfect. Far from it. But in the UK, we've got 7 years. And the way things are looking, certainly over the last few months, is that that is enough time, providing that this tremendous impetus which is out there among the farmers at the moment means that you will work together with a common aim and not against one another. If we take experience and advice that exists, if we take foreign models, not to impose them in the UK. People have said to me, we're too different in the UK, don't you come here with your foreign models. I'm not coming here with foreign models. What we're doing is we're coming along and we're saying it works in this country, it works in that country. Let's adapt it to the UK and make it work in the UK, because the cooperative principles work everywhere, from Australia to Brazil to India to France. They will work here, and nothing has been found that's better. It's a little bit like democracy. It may not be perfect, but certainly no one's found anything better for farmers. If we do that, we get experience, we get advice, then we can avoid all the mistakes of the past. And now it's looking not that we've been wasting time, it looks that now we've got a tremendous opportunity. We don't have to make the mistakes that all the others have made. We've already got the potential to have 3, 4, 5 large co-ops in the UK. We're not going to have to spend all our lives merging small co-ops with all the arguments and problems that this creates. We can get straight down to business. And if we can pull this together, create a cooperative federation which will serve all of these cooperatives and thus their members as well, the farmers as well, then we can start to exploit from some of the tremendous potential that being among the world's most efficient dairy producers gives us, and hopefully in some of the most efficient dairy cooperatives. What's the alternative? The alternative is this. There are retailers who are big. There are processors who are very big. And there are farmers who are very small. And at the moment, you have the chance to start learning to play their game with their ball. If you don't, you remain 0.014% of Dairy Crest's intake. You're not going to be playing the same game as them, and you can, if you think that things are going to change in the future, that the environment is going to change in your favour, you can forget it. The only way for the farming community, the dairy farming community in the UK, to keep its end up, to represent itself, to make its true value felt in terms of price and respect in the dairy chain, is to play the same game as the processors, as the retailers. This can only be done by creating powerful, economic-based cooperatives that are there to increase the price of milk for the farmer and to support the price of milk nationally, once again, for the farmer. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Cookson, and I've been asked by the Federation of Milk Producers campaign to talk to you about cooperative structures. I don't intend to try and convince you why cooperatives are essential to the UK dairy industry. I assume that if you're listening to this video that you're already convinced. My aim today is to give you some frameworks within which you and your colleagues can create and make work your own dairy cooperatives. The examples I'm going to give you are drawn from abroad, where, as I've already said on another occasion, cooperatives really do work and have worked for tens of years. My aim is to present to you frameworks within which you can fit your activities, the activities of your cooperative, in your environment and to supply in the best possible way your markets. We're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the way cooperatives themselves can be structured. Then we're going to look at the way the cooperatives themselves must be federated, and we've already got in the UK the Federation of Milk Groups, the FMG, which is going to be the vehicle for doing this. And finally, I'll just give you an example, in this case from France, of how that federation itself must, in the long term, in the next 5 or 10 years, fit into a complete interprofessional dairy structure within the UK. Only if all three of these aspects are carried out properly will we be able, together with the processors and the retailers, to push forward the UK dairy industry and make it a European force capable of supplying the biggest and best of the European retailers. If I don't answer all your questions, hopefully by the time you've seen the end of this video, you will at least know what questions you should be asking of the cooperatives that you're joining. Let's start off, though, by looking at what are the key issues in dairy cooperation. The key issues for all dairy co-ops, whatever form they take, as long as their aim is to ensure the highest price for their members' milk. The first thing a cooperative has to do is it has to convince you, the farmer, what economic advantages, what pluses it's going to bring to you. Not only it's got to tell you how it is intending to get the milk price higher, what its actions are going to be, but it's also got to say how it's going to treat you as a member, what services it's going to give you, and what the cost of this is likely to be. It's also going to have to explain to you where it fits in the dairy supply chain, short term and long term. This should not be a problem. Cooperatives, and some people tend to forget this, are not written in stone. They have to fit the agricultural and farming environment of their members. The cooperative that is there to serve the farmers in the north of Scotland will probably not have exactly the same form, although its functions may be the same, as a cooperative in the west of England. History has shown that the cooperative has always adapted its form to fit the type of agriculture and the farming of the area which it's representing. But not only must it fit the agricultural environment, it also has to fit its downstream environment. What's the downstream environment? It is the type of processors or retailers which it has chosen to sell to. If these are small specialist cheese farmers, they will not be looking for the same thing as a large liquid milk plant. So it has to adapt to its downstream environment. The cooperative will tell you what its environment is. You have to be convinced that it is setting up the structures and the commercial structures that will allow it to serve that environment. It has to be democratic. A cooperative is a mini democracy. How will this democracy work? We'll look at this in a bit more detail later on, but you have to be clear in your mind that it is democratic, that you are being treated fairly. Treating you fairly involves taking account of the different sizes and the different conditions of farmers who are in this cooperative. We're talking not about equality, we're talking about equity, fairness of treatment. We're talking also about limiting cost. Everybody knows, it's no secret, that the structures that existed in the UK in the past were not lean and mean. You don't have to be mean, you do have to be lean. Your cooperative has to show all the time, just like any other company, that it is saving your money where your money can be saved. But nonetheless, you also, as board members, as delegates to the General Assembly, have to leave enough freedom to the management to get on with their business. You mustn't be under their feet all the time. What else does a cooperative have to do? It has to define its commercial relationships with you. You are a supplier, you're not just an owner, you're also a supplier. These relationships have to be very clearly defined so that you don't feel that you are being treated unfairly, and that none of your colleagues can come along and say, I'm also a shareholder, I'm a co-owner, I demand to be treated better. No. This is all about fairness, transparency, and clarity in relations with suppliers. Then, in the UK, we're talking about creating very large cooperatives. Cooperatives that will be treating somewhere between 2, 3, 4, 5 billion litres of milk. These cooperatives of that size have to define clearly how they are going to fit in the national cooperative scene and even internationally. These are questions which you can ask. They're perhaps not the questions to be asked when you're setting up the cooperative or when you're coming into the cooperative, but they are important for the future of your cooperative. And finally, an area which poses a great deal of trouble, a great deal of potential trouble in cooperatives is how are we going to make and control and structure our downstream investments, our investments in processing. This has to be quite clear from the outset how it's going to be done, how it's going to be funded, and how you, the farmers, are going to be convinced that that investment is being made in your best interests and is being run in the best way possible. Now those are general considerations for all cooperatives and all farmers going into cooperatives. Once we've sorted that out, and they're generally sorted out very simply in the cooperative statutes, its articles of association if you will, they're written down in paper, and then we can get on with the main business, which is to create among the cooperatives operating in the UK a unified base which will support the milk price and not drive down the price by useless competition, and we're not talking under any circumstances about creating monopolies. We're talking about, once we've got the cooperative structured the way we want, creating a coordinating structure nationwide, a federation of milk groups capable of representing all cooperatives, lobbying internationally, dealing with common problems, sorting out problems before they happen. You'll see that in every country where cooperatives exist and have existed for a long time, there is a federation. This federation is then integrated into the interprofessional dairy structures of the country, and we'll see this a bit later on. This federation will itself be responsible for the technical and marketing support structures which concern the profession as a whole, as manifested in the cooperatives themselves. It will supply information, it will give price information, it will supply training, it will do all these things which have been totally lacking in the UK for the last 60 years. And finally, the thing that remains to be done after that, in fact we should be doing it all the time, is to make sure that we have a very clear interface between our cooperative and our federation of cooperatives and the NFU. It is unrealistic if we think that the cooperatives can be run totally separately from the farmers' union. In no country that I know of anyway, and certainly not in Europe, is there a real separation between the farmers' representation and the cooperatives. That said, let's now go back to the structure of your cooperative, and let's see what can really go wrong if you get it wrong. This wonderful picture here, which is totally out of focus, and it was always out of focus, nobody ever really understood it, is the organogram of a French cooperative called ULN. ULN is, to my knowledge, the only large cooperative in Europe which has gone bankrupt and been allowed by the other cooperatives and the cooperative banks to die. It was such a disaster. I think if we just look at this organogram, we can see why it died. The green ring at the top are all the little cooperatives which were the owners of ULN. Now ULN, when it died, was doing about £1.5 billion turnover. It was the second largest dairy cooperative in France. It was owned by cooperatives in such a way, there were so many of them, that nobody controlled it. The reality was that the cooperative was controlled by its management and not by its farmers. And unfortunately, that management forgot that it was a cooperative, and it thought that it was Nestlé, Nestlé 1, Nestlé 2, Danone. It thought that its vocation was to expand worldwide and to do what Nestlé and Danone do. And it forgot that it was there to optimize the milk price. What happened was that the cooperative structure was totally unclear, and here we can see I put a little ring around the only part of the whole group which was involved in added value chilled dairy products. You can see that even that little bit was owned by so many other subsidiaries that it was impossible even within the group to see who actually controlled it. The result was that it made some absolutely disastrous investments in Spain and in Belgium, where it had no right to be anyway, and it bellied up to the extent that even the banks couldn't save it. This is the mistake not to make, and there's no reason in the UK why we should make it, because we're lucky in as much as we're going to start off our dairy cooperative existence with probably 4 or 5 very large co-ops which are not themselves made up of other cooperatives. So the control by the owners will be much more simple, and then it's down to management and the farmers to make sure that the structure, the downstream structure, is logical and can be controlled by them. Let's look at an example that does work. This is another cooperative. This is Sodial, which deals with about 3 billion litres of milk in France, and it is owned by, as we can see, a group of 7 cooperatives. They have formed themselves into a union, which is called Sodial Union. This union owns companies. What has happened is that it has totally separated the farmer control, the union, from the subsidiaries which are involved in production and marketing. So the first one we can see on the left is the Yoplait brand, which you all know. They have a joint venture with Dairy Crest. It's a worldwide brand of yogurts and dairy desserts. They also have a very strong brand of UHT milk in France and a few other countries called Candia. They're also reasonably strong in cheese. And then at last, up the column on the right, is the industrial activities, the powder, the butter, and so forth. It's a logical downstream structure which belongs to a holding group which is itself the Farmers Board, Sodial Union. It's a logical structure and has nothing to do with the previous organogram that I've shown you. It has some problems today in its industrial processing branch, but they can be handled within the industrial branch because it's a clear structure and the members know what's going on and clear proposals can be made to them. It's a logical structure, even though it has an upstream Achilles heel. There are too many small cooperatives that own it. But that, as I've said, in the UK is not going to be a problem because we're going to start off with large, powerful co-ops. If we look at, from a schematic point of view, what is a cooperative? What questions are we going to have to ask when we come into a cooperative or when we restructure a cooperative, look at its structure again, say, is this really the capital structure, the communications, the shareholder, the ownership relationships that we want? So what we've got here is not a flow chart. On the left, we've got each co-op. That means whatever sort of cooperative you're going into, you should be at least asking these questions. And the fact of asking questions is not something which is aggressive. It doesn't imply you know the answer. It just implies that this, you know, is an area which must be looked at. In most cases, your cooperatives have looked at it already, but you have the right to ask the question. The first thing is the simplest thing, but many people forget it. Your cooperative has to have a mission statement, and it's got to say how it's going to apply that. That mission statement has got to say that the aim of the co-op is to get the best possible prices for your milk. It can say other things as well. It can say things about the environment. It can say anything you want it to say. But what it says is the way it and you are going to live for the next 5, 10, 15 years. It'll talk about, your statutes will talk about, you must talk about how the cooperative is going to relate with the farmers, with its members. And here it becomes complicated. We've got to get it right, and there's no reason why we shouldn't get it right. But you've got to remember that the farmer in a cooperative is in fact wearing 2, and in some cases 3 hats. First of all, the farmer is a shareholder. The farmer is the owner. And what we've got to sort out is how much of the capital does he own? How is he going to vote? The two are not necessarily the same, rarely the same. But what we're looking for is equity. We're looking for fairness all the way through. You should never toss and turn at night in your bed thinking that your cooperative is treating you unfairly. So we've got to look at capital and voting. We've got to look at how you are represented in the decision-making structures of that cooperative as an owner. And we've got to look at how you and your colleagues can come into that cooperative and leave that cooperative. Does it cost you money to come in if you're a newcomer? Do you get money back when you leave? How much money do you get back? When? This sort of question, answers are simple. They have to be thought out in advance, not afterwards. But you, the farmer, are also the supplier of that cooperative. And here we've got a whole series of other questions which have got to be answered in advance. Firstly, pricing. Also, are we going to differentiate? Are we going to have a different milk price in different regions? Are we going to have a different milk price for different types of suppliers? Big ones, small ones, specialist producers? Of course we are. All this has got to be decided up front. These are questions which you have to ask, and you are in your right to expect a response. We're going to look at something which may seem simple to you, but with the abolition of quotas on the horizon, it's got to be thought about. The supply and processing obligations. A cooperative involves 2 obligations. You, the farmer, are obligated to supply your cooperative. Are you going to supply all of your production? Normally, yes, but perhaps not. The cooperative is obligated, normally, to take and process for selling all of your milk. Is that going to be the case for the future? Are we going to go for direct contracts in some cases? Why not? Everything is possible. Everything is acceptable if it makes sense to you and if it is fair to you and to the other members. We've got to think about it now. And also, as suppliers, you want to know what technical support you're going to get from your cooperative, and obviously the logistics of collection and payment. You have to know all these things. That's the nitty-gritty of everyday life. It's not going to pose a problem, but you have the right to ask the question when you go into a new cooperative. And if you don't feel a year later that you've got proper answers, ask the question again. The third possible hat that you'll be wearing, probably not initially in the UK, but it will come, is as clients of your cooperative. It is perfectly logical that the cooperative, being as big as it is, can buy some of the things that you need to run your farm cheaper than you can do yourself. So it's quite conceivable, and in fact desirable in many cases, that you should be the cooperative's client for services and for grouping purchases. That's another relationship which you have to deal with. Then, for each cooperative, we've got to look at the internal structures and the regulations. What sort of things are we talking about? Well, the first thing that comes to mind is subsidiaries. If we're going to go into processing, if we're going to start supplying the farmers with inputs or with supplies, we're probably going to be creating subsidiaries. How are we going to control these subsidiaries? Or is the cooperative just going to do that directly? All of these things have to be decided. There are no hard and fast rules. It depends on the circumstances. We do what best suits our members, what best suits the economic situation. There are simple things like personnel. Your cooperative is an economic entity. It's going to have salaried personnel. You've got to have people who can motivate these personnel, and you've got to have a salary structure. Too many cooperatives in continental Europe have delayed taking on top-class management because the farmers could, especially in the hard, difficult years, couldn't envisage paying the sort of salaries that the market demands. You've got to have a policy for handling that. Training. This is also important. A small cooperative can't afford it, but a cooperative dealing with 4 billion litres of milk, with maybe 4,000, who knows, farmers, must have a training program, not just in the technicalities of dairy production and collection, but also training farmer representative board members in the activities of the co-op, the basics of marketing, the basics of finance, so that they can represent the other farmers, ask the right technical questions, not necessarily find the solutions. That's not what they're looking for. You pay people to do that, but to understand the life of the cooperative for which they are responsible and which is helping them to sell their milk. And last, but really not least, your cooperative has to have a policy of communication. Communication with farmers. This communication, whatever form it takes, has to ensure that farmers feel involved in the major decisions which are being made, and that they're not informed after the events, but that they are informed before important events happen. They're told why it's being done, what the risks are, but obviously what the benefits are going to be for them. That way, the board, the management, is not acting alone, it's acting cooperatively. What else do we have to look at when we're creating a cooperative or when we come into a cooperative? We've got to look at the funding, obviously. How is it being funded? From the milk price, obviously, but maybe there are bank loans, there can be current accounts from members. There are an enormous variety of ways in which a cooperative can be funded equitably. There's no one rule for it, but you've got to talk about it, you've got to find out how the money is going to come in, especially if it's your money. And finally, a point which is important, very important in continental Europe, but probably will be less important in the UK, where we're going to start off with 3, 4, 5 major co-ops, mergers and acquisitions. How are these going to be treated by the cooperative? All of these are the life of the cooperative. You, as a new entrant into these co-ops, or as somebody who's been in the cooperative for several years, you have the right, in fact, you have the obligation to ask these questions if the answer has not already been made clear to you. But one final point on this, and we've been talking about structure here, is that structures are important, but equally important are people. And what we find with the most successful cooperatives that have been created on the continent is that they are a combination of intelligent structures pushed along by people who really believe that cooperation is the way forward for themselves, but also for their farmer colleagues, and that by working together And by looking at all these aspects, we really can push forward the milk price and ensure markets for the future and for future generations. Now, it is all too easy, having created our cooperatives, having created an embryonic FMG, for you to sit back and say, oof, we've done it. We're no longer direct suppliers, we're in cooperatives, we're convinced now that we're running the cooperatives ourselves and they're in our interest, now let's get back to the cows. You can't do that. It doesn't work. You have created a living entity. You have on the one hand yourselves, and on this slide you can see the members, and on the other hand, on the other side, you've got what I called cooperative, which is the executive. That's the easy bit. Your cooperative is doing 4 billion litres. Obviously it has a lot of high quality management. They're going to be doing marketing, they're going to be handling the plant, the personnel, the legal side, the financial aspects. That's easy. You say, right, that's their job. Now I can relax. No, you can't. You have a responsibility towards yourselves and towards your colleagues, if you are elected members, to be there and to give the driving force to that company. You and the chairman whom you will elect are the head of that company, and everybody knows that no organization is better than its chief executive, or in this case, than its chairman. So what is your role in this cooperative from now on? Your role is that you have to provide the drive and the motivation for the management. If you saw the case of ULN, the French cooperative which collapsed, the members were not present. The farmers were not present there. Now, if there's no owner, then the management does either what it thinks is best for you, or what it thinks is best for itself. That is not possible. You've got to give the drive and motivation through the supervisory board, the board of members, to the management all the time, regularly. You have got to underline to the management that they are working towards cooperative aims, which is to increase or to give you the best possible milk price. You have the knowledge of your region and the needs of the farmers. Your cooperative has to serve you and your colleagues. If it is not responding to your needs, to changes in the agricultural structure in your area, it will cease to work, or it will not work as well as it should do. You know what farming technology is needed. You know that your cooperative is there to help you benefit from this. You know how you would like your milk to be collected. That's not necessarily the way it's going to be, but you have to make your voice heard so that the professional management can come back to you and, to the extent possible, do what you want in this company. Okay? Now, where it works, where we have responsible members and responsible and competent management, then things like partnerships, mergers, downstream investment, diversification, segmentation, pricing, all become workable. Not easy, but workable, and can be optimized for the interests of everybody. But even then, there are two people in every cooperative who are absolutely key. On the one hand, the chairman, who is the boss of the company in the sense that he represents the interests of all the farmer members, but also he is the boss of the managing director. And what we find is that where there is a positive and dynamic farmer chairman, and there is a competent managing director who is aware of the cooperative realities and of the realities of farming, a cooperative is unbeatable, because it has a driving force which makes it something to be reckoned with in the markets, and it also has the competence necessary to set that through into the markets. Where that handshake does not take place, and we saw it in the case of poor old French ULN, you find a them and us mentality taking place, fights within the cooperative, and it doesn't work. So it is, as I've said earlier, it's a question of structures, responsibility, and people. Let's now move on to the federation. We've created our co-op, the structure fits what we want to do, and we've got the right people in there. This isn't enough. We have to, at national level, as in all countries where dairy is a power and where farmers play their role in the supply chain, we have to have a federation of dairy cooperatives. What do these federations do? What will your FMG do? This slide gives you a list of what such federations do on the continent. They do two major things. The first one is that they defend the material interests of the dairy co-ops who are their members and their owners. Technical, economic, legal, fiscal lobbying. Material interests. If the tax regime's going to change, they're in there lobbying. But also the moral interests. This federation should be defending cooperatives, should be defending British dairy farming vis-à-vis the public, vis-à-vis the government, vis-à-vis the retailers. But that's defensive. The federation is there not just to defend you, it's there to promote the farming, it's there to promote the dairy sector. And that's where it becomes really exciting. It can take initiatives which are in the interest of all the cooperatives who are its members, useful for the development and organization of members. What sort of things are we talking about? We're talking about communication. We're talking, especially in the beginning in the UK, about training. Even the biggest of your cooperatives is going to have a hard time setting up the training programs which have to be set up quickly for farmer representatives so that they can run their cooperatives knowing firstly what their responsibilities are, and secondly what the marketing is, what the processing is, and so forth, to become capable of carrying out their mandates. Training, very important. Why should one cooperative do all this when in fact it's a national problem? The federation, given the budget, should, as it does in other countries, set up this sort of communication, this sort of training program. What else is it going to do? Well, in other countries, it creates structures to improve quality, to sell and export milk. Now, the UK is not an exporter, but in Germany, the Cooperative Federation has set up many, many years ago one organization in Hamburg to export milk powder on behalf of the then many small cooperatives. All this can be done through the federation. It can buy inputs globally, if it wants, for its cooperative members. It can make generic publicity or specific publicity for the products or for the cooperatives. It's also there to ensure that wherever there is a need, that farmers should create other groupings which are cooperative as well. Now, this may be in dairy supply, this may be technological. There are all sorts of other areas within dairy where farmer groupings can be made, and not necessarily within the existing co-ops, although you have the ability to do that as well if you want to. They can assist in that context in setting up the co-ops with standard statutes, standard articles of association. It will, the federation will, represent the dairy co-ops in all the national and interprofessional organizations within the UK and eventually within Europe. You say to me, but there are no interprofessional organizations in the UK. Right, there aren't. One of the major problems of UK dairying is that we don't have these interprofessional structures which allow us to work together with the processors and the retailers. When the FMG is up and running and has the respect it deserves from the processors and the retailers, at that stage, as we will see, its next step will be to start creating these structures which are the strength of the German and the French dairy industry. It can also register trademarks. Now, this is interesting. Little red tractors. Who are they going to belong to? They could very easily, or it could very easily, be registered in the name of the FMG. And the FMG would then allow all its members to use it. Now, if this creates problems, then one cooperative will register it as its own. If it doesn't, then it can be registered for everybody at the level of the FMG. In France, the equivalent is partly responsible for laboratories which do product development which is in the interest of the whole profession. I'm not suggesting this is one of the key roles of the FMG in the UK today, but this is the sort of thing to which it will develop eventually. And, of course, it can be a supplier of information, a supplier of documentation. On markets, it will supply the information which will make the market transparent and make the farmer realize that he knows what's going on, and thus give him more and more confidence in his co-op and what that co-op's doing. It's all too easy to think when we talk about a federation that the federation is almost has the role of a holding company as we know them. It's the owner. It's not. Whenever you imagine the FMG or any federation of cooperatives, never put it at the top of the page, always put it at the bottom. It is owned by the farmers, as we can see on this slide here, who own their cooperatives, and those cooperatives own the federation. It is there to serve the co-ops who are its members, just as the co-op is there to serve the interests of the farmers who are its members. Now on this slide we've got different sized cooperatives. We've got some cooperatives who group together in regions, and those regions send delegates to the FMG, and we even got unions of cooperatives because these all exist on the continent. In the UK the structure certainly initially is going to be much simpler because we'll just have, as I've said, 4 or 5 large cooperatives. But the key thing to remember is that a federation of dairy cooperatives must be open to all dairy cooperatives who share the same aims of defending and promoting their members' milk price, their members' interest in the markets. This is the sort of structure which we're looking towards. If we look at it in a bit more detail, what we find is that the federation in fact is just a super co-op. Instead of having farmer members, it has cooperative members. The problems it has, not the problems, the structure that it has will reflect what we've seen in the co-ops themselves. It will have a mission statement, and it will have to show how it's going to put that into application. But let's remember that the FMG's mission statement goes in 2 directions. It has to say what its mission is for its members, the cooperatives and the farmers, but also regarding third parties, because this is also your window to the outside world. It's the dairy cooperative's window to the outside world. So it has to have a policy of how it is going to project British dairying and British cooperative dairying nationally and internationally. It has to decide on membership, representation, voting. We've seen all that for the co-op. It has to be sorted out equitably at the level of the federation. Funding also has to be sorted out. How is it going to be paid for? It's going to be paid for by subscriptions from the member co-ops. They want to get value for money. This has to be sorted out right from the start. Relations with members. Here we go again. Capital and voting, representation, entry, exit. All of this is important. It's simple. It's been done elsewhere. There are models, but we have to fit it into the British context and do it earlier rather than later. And then there's an international structure which we have to look, an internal structure and regulations, just like for any co-op. There are going to be staff members, there's got to be training, and there's got to be communication. The important thing here is that both the training and the communication obviously will concern the staff of the federation, but also will be training for the cooperatives and the cooperatives members, and communication to the cooperatives and the cooperatives members themselves. So this federation is the linchpin to the success of dairy cooperatives in the UK. It is there to render services to the cooperatives to which it belongs and who are its members. Finally, let's just look at the French situation. Now, I'm not going to say that in any way the UK is going to develop the same way as France did. French dairying has taken 150 years to develop. The French deal with 24 billion litres of milk, not far off double the UK. It is one of the driving forces in dairying in Europe and in the world. And one of the reasons, though, is that it has an interprofessional structure which takes account of all needs and all aspects of dairying. But in this case, not just cooperative. The cooperatives represent 50%, 55% of total milk pool, but also it represents the very powerful, almost equally powerful, private dairy companies and quoted dairy companies. So let's just spend a little bit of time looking at this slide here. The first thing we see is the FNCL. That is the French equivalent of the Federation of Milk Groups. It represents the cooperative collectors and processors of milk in France. Just above it is the similar organization which represents the private and quoted dairy companies. They are physically all in, which I translate as the House of Milk, the Maison du Lait. It's a building in Paris where pretty well everybody concerned with the interprofessional dairy organizations is grouped. Lots of these people are competitors, but within this organization they are there to discuss and push forward items, things which they have in common. So you've got the FNCL, the co-ops, the FNPL, which is the private processors. What we also find is that they are the interprofessions, but at the bottom we can see that there are backup organizations, one of the most important of which is the CIDIL. This integrated structure provides the information and the communication which the whole dairy industry needs and which it's cheaper and more efficient to do together. Integrated in this we have the cooperatives, as I've said, the private sector, but also because the different dairy products, cheese, fresh products, drinking milk, are so different, there are also talking shops, committees, working groups, call them what you will, what I call here interprofessions by products, where the cooperative and the private sector come together to deal with common problems in Emmental cheese, which is SIGF, in fresh products, in drinking milk, in melted cheese. Everywhere where there is something to be handled together, and we're absolutely not talking about cartels, there is an interest to bring people together, to avoid conflict, and to have a catalyst for progress. The French have done this. They've had 60 years to do it. We are on the second rung of the ladder at the moment in the UK. We've created our co-ops. We're now creating our federation of milk groups. When that is in place, when it is doing what's necessary for the survival and help to its own cooperatives, then it will be possible to talk to the processors and the retailers as equals and go further towards this sort of structure. Let's end by looking at what's to be done. In fact, what we're looking at is what's been done and what remains to be done. So we'll just go through them point by point. Group producers together. Done it. Group those producer groups into, in Europe, unions, in the UK, viable cooperative units. Done it. We're doing it. Let's assume it's been done. It's an enormous step further, which nobody in the UK or outside the UK would have deemed even possible 6 months ago. Then federate the co-ops nationally. We've done that as well. It's the FMG, but we've got a lot further to go with it yet. We've got to develop for the FMG clear objectives and strategies, and that really is the next step. After that, then, as I've shown you in France, the same in Germany, we'll integrate that federation into a national interprofessional structure. Then we can start developing meaningful downstream strategies for the dairy industry in the UK, and we can implement them and ensure control. If I'd said that 2 years ago in the UK, I'd have been laughed out of pretty well any farmers' meeting in the country. Nowadays people go, oof, will we really get there? But nobody says it's impossible. Why do they not think it's impossible? Because we've already done the impossible. We're actually structuring a large, by far the majority, of the UK milk pool into cooperatives. And we've already got a federation, so why can't we go further? Of course we can go further. Because then, at the end, we will have in the UK what we've never had before, and what the French have, what the New Zealanders have, what the Australians have, and that is an interprofessional organisation which can play a responsible role in developing the profession along with all the other operators. Not just fighting over price, but talking about quality, talking about new product development, talking about satisfying the consumers. But one thing we do have to remember, and that is that it can only be done if we do it. And just remember, there's no free lunch. Thank you.